There are secrets that even the most pompous title cannot hide. His, pretending he never existed. Alexander Everett, the Duke of Wynthorne, was about to commit the greatest folly of his life. Cloaked under the cover of night, he adjusted the simple hat on his head, a modest piece that would never be seen on a man of his stature. He was tired of being the center of attention, of the constant pressure to save his failing dukedom, and of being the subject of malicious whispers at London's most lavish parties. A duke without fortune is no duke at all, they said, always loud enough for him to hear. Thus, on that spring night, Alexander decided it was enough. He would temporarily leave Wynthorne Hall and reinvent himself far from the gleaming halls. In a modest village on the Yorkshire border, where no one knew his face or lineage, he would simply be Alexander, an ordinary man. And with a touch of irony, he would take on the role of manager at an old inn, the Rose and Laurel, a small business teetering on the edge of ruin. It was madness, of course. But it also seemed like the only chance to discover who he was beyond his title. What he didn't expect, however, was to meet Helena Whittaker. Helena was the kind of woman who made any man rethink his certainties. She had curly brown hair that stubbornly escaped from her bun, a sharp mind that cut faster than any blade, and a talent for cooking that turned simple ingredients into true works of art. She didn't know who he really was, and Alexander was determined to keep it that way. After all, how could a ruined duke earn the respect of such an independent woman? But there was something curious about the way Helena looked at him, as if she could see beyond the layers of mystery he had built around himself. She was the opposite of what he expected. She didn't flatter, didn't care about formalities, and above all, challenged him with every word. "Well, Mr. Everett," she said on the day he started working, "I hope you know this is no life for the weak. In the kitchen, no one is treated like nobility." Alexander smiled, a smile that masked his discomfort. He was used to dealing with ambitious politicians and calculating ladies, but Helena Whittaker, she was completely uncharted territory. The Duke of Wynthorne, or rather Alexander Everett, the new manager of the Rose and Laurel, woke up on his first day with the feeling that he had traded one crown of thorns for another. The walls of the room he would now call his own were worn, with peeling paint and the scent of old wood lingering in the air. It was a stark contrast to the grand halls of Wynthorne Hall, but it also carried an honesty he hadn't felt in years. In the kitchen, Helena awaited him with the critical gaze of someone who knew he wasn't ready for what lay ahead. She instructed him to start by washing pans. "You want to manage this inn? Then you need to understand how it works, starting with the basics." The work was grueling. Hot water burned his hands, the smell of grease clung to his clothes, and Helena's orders gave no respite. Yet, curiously, Alexander did not resent it. On the contrary, the feeling of using his hands for something tangible, even if tedious, was oddly satisfying. "Mr. Everett," Helena called, leaning over the counter to observe him. "That pan won't clean itself. Faster, please." He suppressed the urge to roll his eyes and replied with a wry smile. "I thought cooks were known for their patience." "Only with delicate pastries," she shot back. "And you're not one of them." The day passed in the blink of an eye, with customers coming and going, the constant bustle of the kitchen, and the challenges of running the inn. Alexander began to notice small details. The way Helena corrected the young apprentices with firm kindness, how her laugh would escape unexpectedly when a customer told an absurd story, and the sparkle in her eyes whenever she perfected a dish. That evening, as they set the tables, Helena looked at him with a mix of curiosity and fatigue. "You don't seem like a man who's spent his life in inns. Where are you from exactly?" Alexander hesitated. The truth was on the tip of his tongue, but he swallowed it with effort. "From far away," he replied. "Very far away." Helena raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "I hope you brought determination with you. We'll need it." As she left the room, Alexander felt a tightness in his chest. It wasn't just the lie he had told, but the uncomfortable realization that with each passing day, Helena was seeing him more clearly than anyone ever had. Helena Whittaker had a unique skill, transforming simple ingredients into dishes that warmed the heart. However, Not even the best recipe in the world could pay off the Rose and Laurel's debts. That morning, she was more tense than usual. The numbers didn't lie. If she couldn't find a way to attract more customers, the inn wouldn't survive another quarter. Helena hid her worry well, but Alexander, always observant, noticed the crease of concern between her brows as she reviewed the accounting records. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, leaning casually against the kitchen doorframe. Helena looked up, forcing a smile. "Everything is perfectly under control. Why don't you get back to the pans, Mr. Everett?" Alexander didn't move. He knew what it was like to pretend to be in control when everything was falling apart. It was a performance he knew all too well. "If you need help," he said in a more serious tone, "you know where to find me." Helena sighed but didn't respond. Alexander knew she was too proud to accept his offer, and that both frustrated and impressed him. That afternoon, while serving tables, Alexander overheard murmurs about an illustrious guest expected to arrive in the village by the end of the week. Count Daman, a man known for his influence and wealth. Apparently, the Count planned to stay at the Rose and Laurel. "What is he doing here?" Helena asked after one of the kitchen assistants brought the news. Alexander became alert, though he tried to appear indifferent. He knew who Daman was, a political rival of the Wynthorne dukedom, whose reputation for shady dealings was widely known. "Maybe he wants to try your cooking," Alexander said with a smile. Helena scoffed. "Or maybe he wants to buy the inn, like so many others before him. I won't sell it." The words were spoken firmly, but Alexander noticed the doubt in her eyes. He knew the financial situation was dire. If Daman showed up with an irresistible offer, Helena would be forced to choose between keeping her pride or saving the inn. In the days that followed, preparations for Daman's arrival were intense. Helena insisted that everything be perfect, while Alexander helped wherever he could. Although he hadn't revealed his true identity, he began to think of ways to intervene if the Count tried to take the Rose and Laurel for himself. On the night Daman arrived, the inn was packed, with customers drawn both by the Count's fame and Helena's talent. When Daman entered, with his lofty demeanor and arrogant smile, Alexander felt a knot in his stomach. Daman greeted Helena with an exaggerated bow. "Miss Whittaker, it is a pleasure to finally meet you. Your reputation as a cook has already reached London." Helena thanked him, though her smile was strained. Alexander, watching from a distance, saw the calculating glint in Daman's eyes. He wasn't there just to dine, and Alexander knew that sooner or later he would have to intervene, but not as a simple inn manager. Helena Whittaker had faced many challenges in her life, but few made her as uncomfortable as the presence of Count Daman. He was polite, elegant, and absurdly charming, but there was something about his smile that made her want to check if her purse was still there. That morning, Daman requested to meet with her privately. He wanted to discuss a matter of mutual interest. Helena, though hesitant, agreed. She received him in the empty dining room, where Daman seemed far too comfortable, sitting casually in one of the chairs with an air of ownership. "My dear Miss Whittaker," he began, with the smoothness of someone who had won many battles with carefully chosen words. "I have observed your inn and your work in the kitchen. It is clear that you possess a rare talent, something that deserves recognition beyond this small village." Helena crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "And I suppose you have some miraculous proposal?" Daman smiled. "Indeed, I do. I intend to acquire the Rose and Laurel and transform it into a regional landmark. With me, you would have the resources needed to shine. What do you think of becoming my partner?" She kept her expression neutral, but her hands tightened along the edges of her apron. "Turn the inn into something it's not? No, thank you. I'd rather keep it as it is." Daman didn't seem surprised. On the contrary, the glint in his eyes suggested he had expected resistance. But consider this, Helena. Refusing this offer would be a mistake. What will you do when the debts come knocking at your door? Your passion is admirable, but passion doesn't pay bills. Meanwhile, on the other side of the kitchen, Alexander listened to every word. He couldn't decide whether the feeling overtaking him was anger or concern. Helena didn't know what Daman was capable of when crossed. Later, Helena crossed paths with Alexander. He was polishing glasses, but something in his posture made her stop. "You heard, didn't you?" she asked bluntly. Alexander lifted his eyes to her, struggling to appear indifferent. "The conversation between you and Daman? Yes, I heard." "Then you understand why I can't accept," she said with a sigh. "This inn means everything to me. It belonged to my mother. It's the only legacy I have from her." Alexander felt the weight of her words, and for a moment he almost confessed who he really was. He had the resources to help her, but he knew any offer would be seen as charity, and Helena would never accept that. That evening, Daman made a point of being the center of attention during dinner. He praised Helena's dishes, but with a tone that seemed condescending. Alexander observed from afar, his fists clenched under the table. Later, when all the customers had left, Helena approached Alexander. She was exhausted, but there was something lighter in her expression. "Thank you for today," she said with a smile. Alexander tilted his head. "For doing nothing?" "For being here," she replied, simple and honest. For a moment, Alexander wanted to believe that moment was real, that he was just a simple man helping a woman who was beginning to mean so much to him. But the weight of what he was hiding threatened to unravel everything. What he didn't know, however, was that Daman had plans of his own, and Alexander was about to be cornered in a way he could no longer avoid. Daman was a man of many talents, but what he enjoyed most was uncovering secrets. He saw Alexander as an anomaly. There was something about the way he carried himself that didn't align with the image of a simple inn manager. And so, Daman began to investigate. A few letters sent to acquaintances in London, and the truth reached him like a storm on a calm night. Alexander Everett, Duke of Wynthorne. It was an irresistible revelation. Daman knew he could use this information as a weapon, and he didn't hesitate. That evening, while Helena was working in the kitchen, Daman approached with the triumphant air of a cat that had just caught a bird. "Miss Whittaker," he began, setting a glass of wine on the counter. "Did you know your manager is a very interesting man?" Helena looked up, suspicious. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daman leaned slightly, a predatory smile on his lips. "Alexander Everett, the Duke of Wynthorne. He didn't mention that, I imagine. Strange, isn't it? A duke working at an inn. So unusual." For a moment, time seemed to stop. Helena stared at Daman, processing those words, before laughing incredulously. "You're joking. Alexander, a duke? That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Daman countered. "Ask him. Or better yet, see for yourself." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. It was a copy of a letter sent to him by a correspondent in London, confirming Alexander's identity. Helena took the paper with trembling hands. As she read it, her heart sank. The name, the title, everything was there, unmistakable. Alexander Everett, the man she thought she knew, wasn't who he claimed to be. Later that night, when Alexander went to the kitchen to discuss the preparations for the next day, he found Helena holding the letter. She looked furious, but there was something more in her gaze, a deep hurt, as if he had betrayed something precious. "You are the Duke of Wynthorne," she said bluntly. Alexander froze. For a moment, he couldn't find the words. "Helena, I can explain." "Explain what?" she interrupted, her voice raised. "That you lied to me? That you let me believe you were just a simple man while hiding this? Why did you do it, Alexander? What were you trying to prove?" "I didn't want you to treat me differently," he said desperately. "I needed a break from my life, from the title, from everything. And you saw me for who I am, not as a duke." "I saw what you wanted me to see," she retorted, stepping away. "And now? What else are you hiding? What else about you is a lie?" He tried to approach her, but Helena raised her hand, asking for distance. "I need time," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I need to understand what all of this means." As she left the kitchen, Alexander stood there, feeling the weight of guilt crushing him. He knew the truth needed to be told, but he had never imagined it would come out like this. The next morning, the tension was palpable. Helena barely looked at him, and Daman seemed more than pleased with himself. But Alexander knew there was still something worth fighting for, not just the inn, but Helena's love. Helena barely slept after the revelation. Damon's letter still weighed on her mind like lead. Alexander Everett, the man who made her laugh and had been her constant for the past few months, wasn't who he claimed to be. Worse still, Daman seemed intent on using this to his own advantage. That morning, Helena confronted Alexander in the dining room. The space was empty except for the two of them, but the tension could be cut with a knife. "Why weren't you honest from the beginning?" she asked, her voice firm, though her eyes betrayed deep exhaustion. Alexander knew this was his chance to make things right. "I needed a place where I could just be a man, not a title," he explained. "My dukedom is bankrupt. My entire life has been a series of expectations I never asked for. When I came here for the first time, no one knew me. No one wanted anything from me. And then, I met you." Helena shook her head. "And yet, you chose to lie." "I chose to stay," Alexander corrected, his voice heavy. "I chose to help. I chose you." Helena opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by Daman, who entered the room as though he owned it. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said with an exaggerated smile. "But I have news." He pulled out a chair, sitting casually. "I've made an official offer to purchase the Rose and Laurel, and if I may say so, it's a generous proposal. With what you'll receive, you could open a restaurant anywhere you desire." Helena narrowed her eyes. "I've already said I won't sell." Daman shrugged. "You may change your mind when the banks start knocking on your door. Think about it." Alexander could no longer hold back. "You're not interested in the inn, Daman," he said firmly. "You're interested in destroying anything you can't control." Daman smiled like a predator who had just found his prey. "Interesting to hear that from a man who can't even be honest about who he is." Those words hit Alexander harder than he expected. He looked to Helena, hoping for some defense, but she remained silent, processing everything. In the days that followed, Alexander worked tirelessly to prove his intentions were genuine. He helped with kitchen preparations, served customers with patience uncommon for a man of his position, and avoided confronting Daman, though every fiber of his being wanted to. Helena, on the other hand, kept her distance. Her feelings for Alexander were still there, but the wall of distrust that had risen between them was hard to overcome. Finally, on an afternoon when the inn was particularly busy, Daman made his move. During dinner, he revealed Alexander's identity to the customers, insinuating that the Duke was there to take control of the Rose and Laurel. The room erupted in murmurs, and Helena felt every eye in the room turn toward her. But before she could respond, Alexander stood, his expression grave but resolute. "It's true," he said, his voice resonating through the room. "I am Alexander Everett, Duke of Wynthorne. And yes, I came here fleeing a life that suffocated me, but what I found was a purpose that goes beyond any title. This inn, this community, Helena, all of it has taught me more about who I am than any title ever could." Silence fell over the room, and Helena felt a lump in her throat. Daman seemed ready to say something, but one of the inn's oldest customers interrupted. "I don't care if he's a duke or a farmer," the man said, his voice rough but firm. "He works hard, like all of us. That's what matters." One by one, the other customers began to agree, and Daman, realizing he had lost control of the situation, stood up with a false smile. "Well, it seems you've already chosen your side," he said before leaving. Helena remained silent as everyone returned to their meals. When the room had emptied, Alexander approached her, his eyes filled with concern. "Helena, I never wanted to hurt you," he said. But if you can't forgive me, I'll leave. I just want you to know that everything I've done here was for you." Helena didn't respond immediately. She was tired, confused, but one thing was certain. Alexander had risked everything to be honest with her. "I need time," she finally said. "But don't go. Not yet." Alexander nodded, his heart relieved but still full of uncertainty. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. The inn was busier than ever, thanks to the locals' curiosity about the disguised Duke. Alexander did everything he could to help, but Helena still kept an emotional distance. The bond they had built felt as fragile as fine porcelain. Daman, of course, didn't disappear without attempting one last move. That morning, Helena received a formal letter, a final offer to purchase the inn. He offered an exorbitant sum, enough to pay off all the debts and still leave a good profit. But there was an implicit condition. Daman wanted Helena far away from Alexander. She stared at the letter for long minutes before handing it to Alexander without a word. He read it quickly, his eyes darkening with each line. "He thinks he can buy you," Alexander said, his voice filled with contempt. "I'm not as easily bought as he believes," Helena replied, though her voice betrayed the doubt still lingering. Later, when they were alone in the kitchen, Alexander broke the silence. "Helena, you've already given me every reason to leave, and if that's what you want, I will. But please, let me help first. You don't have to accept Daman's proposal. I have resources. I can pay off your debts. The inn will remain yours, and I'll leave." She shook her head, exasperated. "You don't understand, do you? I don't want your charity, Alexander. I want something that can't be bought. Trust. And you broke that." Those words hit him like a punch to the stomach. Alexander realized there was no argument that could fix it. All that remained was to wait and prove, through his actions, that he was worthy of her trust. That same evening, Daman arrived at the inn, a smug smile plastered on his face. He asked to speak with Helena privately, but Alexander stepped in. "What's your real game here, Daman?" Alexander asked, staring directly at the Count. Daman laughed, a cold and calculated sound. "My game? I'm merely offering an opportunity. Helena is smart enough to accept. Or perhaps she's clever enough to see through your facade," Alexander retorted, his voice low and threatening. Helena appeared before things could escalate. "If the two of you are here to measure egos, take it outside. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an inn to run." As she walked away, Daman leaned closer to Alexander. "You think you've won, but you're wrong. A duke living as a commoner? Ridiculous. In the end, she won't choose you." That night, Helena spent hours in the kitchen, alone. She was preparing a simple recipe, but every movement seemed heavy, as if she were carrying the weight of the world. Alexander found her there, watching silently as she finished the dish. "Why are you still here?" she asked, without turning around. "Because I can't leave," he replied, raw honesty in his voice. Helena turned, finally meeting his eyes. "I read your letter," she said, holding the folded paper Daman had left behind. "He thinks he can solve everything with money. But you thought that too, didn't you?" Alexander swallowed hard. "I did. But I don't want to fix anything with money. I want to repair what I broke. With you." Silence lingered between them until Helena let out a long sigh. "Trust is something that has to be rebuilt. I can't promise anything now, Alexander. But if you truly want to try, then stay." The relief Alexander felt was almost tangible. He knew it wasn't a guarantee, but it was a start. The next morning, Daman left the village, frustrated and defeated. Alexander and Helena worked together to organize an event to draw new customers to the inn, a community dinner open to all. With the help of the villagers, the Rose and Laurel came alive again. Epilogue. A shared future. Months later, the Rose and Laurel had been transformed. The debt was paid off thanks to the tireless efforts of Helena and Alexander, who was now her business partner, and something more. It took time for Helena to trust Alexander again. but he never stopped proving his worth. Gradually, the two rebuilt not just the inn, but also what they had between them. One late afternoon, as the sun set over the village, Alexander, now dressed in simple clothes and with flower-covered hands, turned to Helena. "Do you still think I'm no good at this?" She laughed, her eyes sparkling. "You're still terrible with pans, but I might keep you around." He stepped closer, taking her hand. "Around, I hope. Forever." Helena smiled. "Forever sounds good." And so, amidst laughter, challenges, and shared meals, they found not just a future but also a home. Together. If you enjoyed the story of the Duke who chose to trade the grandeur of noble halls for the simplicity of an inn and ended up discovering true love, get ready for another surprising twist. In the video, the Duke was shocked to see 4 children identical to him at the park. Love stories. A Duke also faces a major dilemma. Imagine the shock of finding 4 children identical to him. Who are they? What is the connection between the Duke's past and these mysterious children? A story full of emotion and discovery awaits you. In today's video, we learn that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes we need to leave behind titles and masks to be seen for who we truly are. If you love lighthearted and fun love stories, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us keep bringing you enchanting stories, and we want to hear your thoughts. Comment below. The Duke found his place, if you enjoyed this story. And don't forget, in the first pinned comment, I've left links to amazing books set in the British Regency era that I've read and loved. See you in the next video.